The Prince and Princess of Wales have now spoken publicly for the first time. Camilla was certain that Prince William and Catherine would never dare to take such a step. They confirmed her departure from Windsor Lodge just minutes ago. The locks are once again under palace control. Her staff has been sent away, and the keys she had treated as proof of her lasting control have been taken from her. Nothing about the move looked accidental. Each step had created another reason for the palace to ask questions. However, her departure is far from the most explosive part. William and Catherine decided she could no longer stay because of what had happened. Camilla had been behaving as though she owned Windsor Lodge for several weeks. She approved costly renovations, moved out longtime employees, restricted family access, and started presenting the house to visitors as if Charles had given it to her for good. The difference was now impossible to ignore. What had once been treated as a private matter had become an official concern. At first, nobody challenged her. The silence allowed her to continue. Then Catherine noticed the first thing Camilla didn't think anyone would notice. A number of personal belongings connected to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had disappeared from storage. They had not been lost. Following instructions linked to Camilla's office, they had been wrapped, labeled, and moved into storage. William had not approved it. Catherine had not been consulted. That discovery gave the family a reason to look more closely. It also made every earlier decision seem more serious. It wasn't until one frightened employee quietly broke ranks that the family was informed. The entire dispute changed because of one revelation. What had looked like decoration now looked like an effort to supplant the lodge's previous identity with Camilla's own authority. The employee's fear was itself revealing. People do not usually risk their positions unless they believe something has gone badly wrong. The portraits were relocated, the guest rooms were changed, family plans were suddenly cancelled. When employees questioned the directives, they were informed that the Queen was now in charge of the residence. Catherine didn't blow up. She took a much riskier action. She asked for the documents. Catherine understood that facts would matter more than anger. She wanted a record that could stand on its own. Storage lists began arriving. Renovation requests followed. Access guidelines, staffing adjustments, and formal complaints from home managers all followed. Certain items could not be moved without family approval. According to one notice, that warning was sent to Camilla's office. The papers gave the dispute a shape that words could not erase. Dates, names, and instructions now sat beside one another. Nevertheless, the move went ahead. William came into the story at that point. He discovered that one sealed box held a Diana-related artifact, which he assumed had been shielded from removal without his awareness. This was no longer a dispute about rooms or furniture for William. It tested the limits of Camilla's authority, palace protocol, and family memory. He wanted one clear answer: who had issued the final order? A junior assistant was only the beginning of the paper trail. After passing through Camilla's private office and overcoming 2 objections, it led to a series of instructions that treated Windsor Lodge as her private domain. The fact that royal resources had been used to promote changes that had never been approved was even more troubling. William wanted the matter handled carefully. A rushed accusation could have damaged the very people he was trying to protect. Camilla was put in a situation by that revelation that she was unable to explain through status or ceremony. Hello viewers, do you think it's good that William and Catherine finally confronted Camilla? If you agree with them, please indicate so in the comments. In all honesty, if you adore William and Catherine but continue to watch without subscribing, you are aiding those who wish to keep such stories hidden. If you think Camilla should never have been allowed to use Windsor Lodge like her own property, please subscribe, hit the like button, and forward this video to someone. For Catherine, the important point was simple. Family history could not be moved around simply because someone wanted a different look. Even yet, Catherine made an effort to prevent the dispute from going public. In a private message, she asked Camilla to put the renovations on hold while the family reviewed everything, restore the objects that had been taken away, and reverse the access restrictions. Camilla gave a chilly reply. She asserted that she now had control of Windsor Lodge and that Catherine ought to concentrate on her own home. Camilla was unaware of the full extent of the harm caused by that response. In order to prevent Charles from being humiliated and the family from becoming divided, Catherine had approached her in private. The silence around the changes had lasted long enough. Once the records were gathered, that silence could no longer protect anyone. Camilla rejected her and doubled down instead of taking a step back. In a matter of days, the lodge was described as Camilla's permanent residence in a new set of instructions. Another family visit was canceled, and additional staff members were relocated. However, proof is needed for permanency. Palace officials anticipated finding a formal grant, a lease amendment, or a written directive from Charles. When William demanded the original occupation paperwork, none were discovered. Instead, they discovered a conditional agreement that was contingent upon ongoing family consent and appropriate usage of the home. There was a sentence in the text that Camilla's office had missed. The agreement might be revoked if the royal resources, employees, or property were abused. William and Catherine had stopped questioning whether Camilla had gone too far by the end of the evening. They were getting ready to demonstrate it. All of the warnings, invoices, storage lists, and cancelled access notices were combined by Catherine into a single file. William requested a thorough examination. What happened next was not dramatic in appearance. It was a slow process of checking, comparing, and asking the same hard questions. Additionally, officials had already started looking into the clause that could take Camilla's residence away from her while she continued to act as if no one could remove her from Windsor Lodge. Catherine's initial reaction was containment rather than retribution. Every answer led back to the same place. The office connected to Camilla had been involved again and again. She took the quiet path because she was aware of how easily a private dispute might turn into a public spectacle, and that Charles would be put in the middle as soon as Camilla felt challenged. That made the issue much larger than a disagreement between two women. It became a question of who had the right to decide. A message was sent asking for a quiet discussion away from employees, away from cameras, and away from the individuals who were already murmuring in Windsor's hallways. William knew that a public fight would create another problem. He wanted the facts settled before anyone made a public claim. The meeting didn't last long. First, Catherine held up the missing items. She clarified that a number of items associated with Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had been relocated without permission, and that family access was starting to be impacted by staff changes. She just requested that the removals be halted until William and the household administration could examine what had transpired. She made no accusations or threats. Catherine stayed calm because she knew what anger could hide. A calm record would be harder to dismiss. Camilla did not back down. She answered with the assurance of someone who thought the issue had already been resolved. According to others involved with the conversation, she said that she now had control over Windsor Lodge. She made the hiring decisions. She was in charge of the remodeling. Camilla believed that Catherine ought to concentrate on her own home and cease meddling in matters that no longer affected her. The room's temperature was altered by that sentence. The more the staff checked, the clearer the pattern became. One decision had led naturally to another. In order to avoid embarrassment, Catherine had entered the conversation. The restraint was viewed by Camilla as a sign of weakness. There was no apology for the items taken away, no concern for the impacted family members, and no indication that the modifications would be reviewed. Rather, Catherine received a warning that was passed off as a dismissal. Nobody needed to raise a voice for the seriousness of the situation to be understood. The documents were doing the talking. Take a step back to avoid making the situation more awkward. Catherine, however, did not retreat. The limitations became more stringent throughout the course of the following few days. A family visit that had been scheduled weeks prior was abruptly canceled. 2 longtime workers were informed that their positions were being reviewed. Camilla's private guests were accommodated in a guest suite that had previously been utilized for family get-togethers. Even though the names belonged to persons who had been freely entering the lodge for years, new aides started verifying names at the door. The message was clear. Before anyone could doubt her authority, Camilla was establishing control. The environment, according to one employee, was tight and cautious. The answer left little room for another explanation. Permission to live in a house was not the same as permission to control it. Open communication among staff members in sharing rooms ceased after being given verbal instructions that were reinforced via private messages that disappeared from the regular administrative channels because they were afraid of losing their jobs. Some employees complied. Others started discreetly making copies. That distinction became the center of the dispute. It was simple, but it changed everything. Catherine followed suit. All canceled appointments were documented. Each change in staffing was dated. Each access request was listed next to the response it got. She collected security guidelines, storage lists, renovation notes, and the names of the people assigned to complete each modification. Camilla's confidence had depended on an assumption. The assumption was that nobody would challenge the way she used the house. What had started out as a family dispute was turning into a file. Subsequently, a former employee of the lodge revealed information that directly involved William in the conflict. Camilla's private office was not the only source of funding for the improvements. Invoices revealed the usage of royal household resources for changes that were never fully approved. Maintenance codes that were sufficiently broad to evade quick attention had been linked to payments. The list of required replacements included new furniture. Under structural maintenance, decorative work was visible. Employees tasked with official tasks were being diverted to assist Camilla with her personal arrangements. Now that assumption was gone. William and Catherine were no longer asking whether something felt wrong. They were checking what the rules allowed. It was now an issue of authority rather than taste. The family had tried the quiet route first. That choice mattered because it showed that the conflict had not begun with a public attack. William did not react with the kind of rage Camilla might have anticipated when he saw the records. He fell silent. He went through every page. He questioned who had permitted the storage of Diana-related items, who had reassigned the employees, and who had approved the payments. Every response pointed to Camilla's office. William then asked for the original Windsor Lodge regulations, the documents themselves, not a synopsis or an assistant's explanation. He required the funding conditions, the occupancy terms, the ownership record, and all associated amendments. Palace officials started looking. In Camilla's inner circle, it was first assumed that the assessment would validate what she had been telling people, that Charles had granted her extensive authority, that her position was safe, and that William would disagree but would be unable to do anything without publicly opposing the king. Then, deep within the residence file, an archivist discovered a line. Permanent ownership was not mentioned in the wording. Camilla was not given an unconditional lease. It described a familial arrangement that was subject to ongoing approval and appropriate usage of the property. There was another reference, a different sentence underneath that line. But patience had limits. Once warnings were ignored, a stronger response became harder to avoid. Decoration was not covered by that clause. When family property was regarded as personal property, it involved abuse, unapproved expenditure, limited access, and the authority to revoke occupancy. It seemed that no one had ever read it in Camilla's office. When William discovered the clause, he did not confront Camilla. He waited until staffing orders, funding records, and directives to store family belongings had been compared to the dwelling file. He didn't want any opportunity for misunderstandings, gaps, or simple denial. He had seen enough by the time the meeting was scheduled. Camilla thought the conversation would be about protocol when she walked in. William clarified that it had to do with behavior. The records were now being treated as evidence rather than background material. That changed the tone inside the palace. One by one, he presented the papers to her. The cancelled appointments, the reallocated staff, the renovation fees, the access limitations, and the storage order associated with Diana's possessions. He then posed the query she had shied away from. Why did she have the right? Camilla did not provide a document in response. She responded with a status update. She claimed that Charles had no objections to the adjustments. The household understood her position, and the residence had been made available to her. That was sufficient in her opinion. The staff understood the change too. Instructions that once seemed temporary were now being examined as part of a larger pattern. Every time she changed a room or replaced a staff member, the king's consent did not have to be recorded. William didn't agree. Windsor Lodge was not a personal prize, he reminded her. It contained protected items, official expenses, family history, and agreements between multiple households. Written conditions could not be eliminated by a verbal comprehension. Moving anything related to his mother without telling him was also not acceptable. At that point, Camilla altered her strategy. She cautioned that Charles would be embarrassed if the issue was pursued further. Any public disagreement about the lodge would give the impression that the king was unable to manage his own household. It would make headlines, escalate hostilities, and raise concerns about who was actually in charge at Windsor. The caution was selected. William comprehended. The family averted a commotion by backing down. He would be held accountable for causing one if he persisted. He went on. William mandated that all decisions made since Camilla started using the lodge as her own home be reviewed. Examining occupancy, security, staffing, spending, maintenance, guest access, and removal of possessions was the directive given to officials. On the basis of reputation alone, nothing would be acceptable. Proof was needed for each claim. The focus of that review was Catherine. The written protests from household administrators had been saved by her. Long-serving employees could not be fired without input, several cautioned. Others questioned the use of maintenance accounts for personal changes. One communication requested that Camilla's office postpone transferring family items until their status was verified. The answer was succinct: follow the directions. Confusion was eliminated by that line. Limits had been communicated to Camilla's office. It decided to go on. There were more records after that. Names associated with William's household were listed on a restricted access list in a security notice. According to a personnel document, Camilla's aides were the only ones in charge of the rooms that were previously set aside for family visits. Work requested prior to approval was included in an invoice. The pattern became unavoidable piece by piece. This was not a poor choice. A mechanism was in place. An administrator who was present at a previous planning meeting provided the most insightful testimony. Camilla had talked about the lodge as if everything was fixed in stone. She talked about updated staffing levels, new guest arrangements, and accommodations that were no longer available for shared family usage. One aide said that no one would oppose the Queen when asked if permanent authorization had been obtained. That belief served as the foundation for the plan. It was contested in William's review. Hello viewers, if you believe that William and Catherine will uphold the heritage of Diana and Queen Elizabeth, then show it. Click like and subscribe and yes in the comment section. Those who think their behavior should never be questioned only benefit from silent observation and refusal to support them. Tell this tale to someone who might support William and Catherine. Officials came to a conclusion Camilla had not anticipated by the end of the review. Ownership, a long-term lease, or an unlimited royal donation did not safeguard her position at Windsor Lodge. She had been allowed to live there as long as she respected the home's family purpose and used it appropriately. Additionally, the contracts granted the household the power to step in when those terms were violated. Catherine's file became important because it showed the sequence. Nothing stood alone anymore. William asked for one last confirmation. He needed assurance that the clause could be put into effect without Camilla's approval or Charles writing a fresh order. That evening, the response came. It might. However, it also led to another finding. Camilla had been warned 3 times prior to the start of the assessment. The first warning, the next decision, and the final order could now be placed in order. Together they told a much clearer story. According to Catherine's file, each warning clarified that her power was subject to conditions. They all implored her to change her mind. All 3 were disregarded by her. Whether Camilla had misinterpreted the agreement was no longer up for debate at the palace. It involved determining how to handle a person who had been warned, was aware of the danger, yet continued anyhow. William did not need to guess what had happened. He could see how each step had been recorded. William's sorted file was no longer just a list of issues. It had turned into a roadmap of how Camilla had consolidated her power, one decision at a time. While everyone around her believed that someone else had given their approval, Catherine put the items in order. The room plans arrived first, followed by the staffing schedules and storage records. The security instructions, the maintenance account invoices, and the communication demonstrating how objections had been resolved, followed, not responded, overruled, disregarded. The room itself became a symbol of the larger dispute. Shared family space was slowly being turned into private territory. William was immediately drawn to one picture. Before it started, it displayed a sitting room. Several family items were missing from the same room in a second photo that was shot a few days later. The new furniture was already here. Above the mantel was a fresh portrait. The room now appeared to be claimed rather than shared. That was the idea. The modifications adhered to a well-defined plan rather than being haphazard. That was why the photographs mattered. They showed the change in a way that words alone could not. Priority was given to Camilla's private visitors. Access was managed by her assistants. Employees that supported the previous household were relocated from important locations. Items associated with previous generations were hidden. With each modification, the lodge began to resemble an extension of her private court rather than a family home. The staff had noticed the change long before the public could have known about it. Their quiet observations now carried weight. At that moment, Catherine knew something. Camilla had not been frustrated when she said that she was concentrating on her own home. It was a reflection of a pre-existing plan. One employee's decision to keep a copy proved especially important. A single saved document can become powerful when the surrounding records confirm it. William and Catherine were being forced out of a house Camilla wanted total control over, not just asked to put up with altered decor. A longtime employee, who had been silent up until that moment, provided the most compelling proof. The worker had been present when the initial storage guidelines were established and had witnessed the elder staff members' growing worry. Nobody wanted to forfeit a position they had held for decades or to rebel against a queen. However, one instruction had seemed too important to overlook. The worker had retained a copy. It was signed. The agreement instructed personnel to finish the transfer prior to the next planned family visit and mandated the removal of a number of protected items. The time was crucial. It demonstrated that the items were not relocated due to urgent repairs. Before William and Catherine could see what was going on, they were transferred. The timing removed another possible excuse. The transfer happened after the warning, not before it. Catherine then discovered the caution that was affixed to it. 2 days prior, the warning had been sent. It said that no transfer should take place until ownership and family access had been verified, and that the specified items needed to be consulted. Then came the order to take them out. Camilla's office was aware. The final plausible argument that the disagreement had developed out of confusion was disproved by that finding. The directive was issued following a written explanation of the risk. It had not slipped through an overworked office. The review team's environment shifted. Officials who had been circumspect started talking more candidly. The lodge had been regarded as private property. That fact changed the question from misunderstanding to choice. Someone had been told to wait and chose not to. The transition had been aided by royal resources. Access for the family had been blocked. There were written restrictions in place. Nevertheless, Camilla's delegates made one last attempt at defense. They claimed that Charles had verbally consented. The review was pushed into its most delicate phase by that assertion. Officials looked for evidence to back it up: a royal warrant, a signed letter, a lease modification, a note from the king's confidential secretary, or simply a journal entry attesting to the discussion of permanent authority. Officials who had been careful at first now had less reason to remain silent. The records had given them something solid to discuss. Nothing was present. It's possible that Charles gave Camilla permission to use the lodge. Granting ownership was not the same as that. It's possible that he knew she wanted changes. That was not evidence that he gave his consent for family access to be restricted, household funds to be used, or protected property to be taken away. The search for proof continued because a verbal claim was not enough. The palace needed something that could be checked. Conditions agreed upon in writing could not be changed by words said in private. The absence of such a document mattered. It did not prove every private conversation, but it could not support the claim of permanent control. William then questioned whether it would be possible to end the occupancy without starting a fresh constitutional fight. The attorneys went back to the clause and examined each action in Catherine's file. They came to a clear conclusion. The household had the authority to terminate the arrangement because the terms had been consistently violated. The next action was approved by William and Catherine. A formal announcement was written. It enumerated the violations, mandated that all unapproved work cease, gave the household administration back control, and demanded that Camilla's personal employees vacate the house. Written terms had a clear purpose. They existed so that important conditions would not depend on memory or private conversations. One last line was spoken. There was a deadline for turning in the keys. William and Catherine therefore moved toward a formal answer. They did not want the issue to remain trapped in personal disagreement. Camilla's response within Windsor Lodge was prompt upon receiving the notice. The doors were shut. There were calls. Employees were instructed to keep quiet. The notice was direct because the review had already been completed. There was little value in another round of vague warnings. Palace staff were already compiling inventories, access orders, and a security plan for the handover as Camilla's office looked for someone willing to halt the deadline. For the first time, it was more about how she would respond than whether or not she would go. The car passing past the gates was not Camilla's, and the deadline came on a Windsor morning. It carried the inventory team supervising the transfer, 2 household authorities, and a security supervisor. There were no photographers waiting outside. There was no prepared announcement. Before rumors became uncontrollable, the palace wanted the transfer to be finished discreetly. Once the deadline was set, The question changed again. The issue was no longer whether the house would be reviewed, but how the handover would happen. Camilla's assistants were moving around the lodge. Desk personal files vanished. The main staircase was used to carry garment cases. Cloth-wrapped framed photos were positioned next to boxes with labels. Moving swiftly between rooms, one assistant checked cabinets and drawers against a confidential list. Before Camilla had completed her conversation with Charles, another person stood at the door and demanded to know who had given the go-ahead for authorities to enter. The notice contained the response. By the deadline, Home Administration had regained control. After the final handover, no member of Camilla's private staff could stay. No room could be closed to scrutiny, and no item could depart without being examined. Palace staff prepared for the transfer quietly. Their goal was to complete the process without turning it into a spectacle. The officials didn't quarrel. After reading the terms, they started. The situation was rendered worse by that serenity. Camilla had anticipated opposition that she could escalate into fury. She may have claimed disrespect if she had raised her voice. William would have appeared careless in a public altercation. The calm approach made the moment feel even more serious. There was no performance, only a procedure being carried out. Rather, each motion was measured. Each box was recorded. Written authorization was used to open each entryway. She had nothing dramatic to fight because of the procedure. Then the first argument started. Although Camilla's personal belongings included a set of silver frames, the inventory identified them as belonging to the lodge collection. They had been gifts, according to her assistant. Records were requested by the officials, but they didn't generate any. The frames were still there. Next were two paintings, a writing desk, and a cabinet that held letters from a previous royal family. The same rule was in effect each time. Family property could not be removed, but personal property could. The border Camilla had disregarded was being re-established room by room. Catherine and William weren't there. That was intentional. Camilla was unable to make the transfer into a private show because of their absence. However, every paper on the table contained their authority. Each item had to be checked because the dispute had always included questions about ownership. The inventory made that boundary visible. The pattern had been formed by Catherine's records. The clause had been triggered by William's review. The decision was now implemented by the officials, who had no intention of going back. Before noon, Camilla eventually made her way into the entrance hall. At first, she was calm. She questioned the schedule, requested to see the top official, and stated that the residence could not be turned over while talks with the king were ongoing. In response, the official stated that the notification would not be suspended by any family conversation. The deadline was over. It was no longer occupied. The constraint broke at that point. Camilla claimed that Catherine had planned the humiliation from the start. She said that the inquiries concerning personnel and storage had been fabrications meant to undermine her authority and paint her as an intruder. Then she became enraged with William. The same rule was applied again and again. Personal belongings could leave, but property belonging to the lodge could not simply disappear. Diana claimed that he was punishing everybody who questioned him by manipulating her memory. The space became motionless. The handover instructions already included William's response. Personal history was not the reason for the expulsion. It came after several violations pertaining to protected family property, staffing, spending, and access. The record could not be altered by an accusation. That explanation was rejected by Camilla. Camilla's absence from the first part of the process also mattered. William and Catherine had chosen administration over confrontation. She insisted on keeping one private sitting area closed until Charles made a decision about it. A different key was supplied by her assistant, who refused to put it with the rest. Everything stopped for a few minutes. The notice was examined by the security supervisor. The full occupancy schedule was made available by the senior official. All of the lodge's rooms were listed. No retained suite, private exception, or residual right of access beyond termination were present. The final line of defense failed. Camilla was informed that denying the transfer would be equivalent to keeping the key. She was not threatened by the official. He only said what would come next. The room would be opened, its contents would be recorded, and it would be noted that the key had not been willingly given up. By the time the handover reached the final rooms, the decision had already been settled. The remaining work was practical. The official turned to face Camilla. She nodded slightly. They set the key down on the table. The personal cars were prepared by late afternoon. Under the supervision of inspectors, who compared each package to the inventory, Camilla's employees departed gradually. The last of the boxes were loaded. The foyer was empty. One car stopped at the gates and joined the road that led away from Windsor. The quiet came back inside. The return of the keys was the clearest symbol of that change. Control of the house had moved back to the household administration. However, the palace still needed to select a choice. No public confirmation was desired by advisors. They thought the family might let the story fade by characterizing the departure as a normal shift. Catherine and William couldn't agree. Too many people were already aware of it. There were too many records. There would be space for another rendition if there was silence. They made the decision to talk that night, and what they were willing to verify would make it hard to hide Camilla's departure. Although William and Catherine were careful in their word choice, the meaning was harsh. Camilla was no longer at Windsor Lodge. The house was no longer under the jurisdiction of her private crew. The unauthorized work had stopped. The keys had been returned, and household administration had taken back control of every room, account, and access point. The confirmation spread swiftly. The public statement came only after the physical handover was complete. That order reduced the chance of confusion. Aides in the palace offices knew what the general public did not. This action was not taken voluntarily. It was the outcome of a review that revealed how far Camilla had gone under the assumption that no one would question her. She had considered the house to be permanent. However, the documentation stated differently. William didn't rejoice. He gave the order to start the restoration. The confirmation did not celebrate the result. It simply stated what had happened and made the new position clear. Every item taken out during Camilla's tenure was identified by staff when they reopened storage records. They relied on old room layouts, inventories, and photos. General furniture was kept apart from items related to Queen Elizabeth. Before being returned, anything connected to Diana was compared against William's records. Out of all the boxes, one stayed sealed for a longer period of time. It held the private thing that initially brought William into the conflict. The label indicated that it had been slated for transfer elsewhere, but the covering was still intact. The object might have vanished into a larger royal collection, far from the lodge, and unnoticed by people who were familiar with its past, had the employee not spoken. Catherine observed the restoration without making it a show of triumph. For her, the result was never about moving in with another woman. It had to do with establishing a border. Restoration became the next task. The palace now had to repair the practical damage created during the period of disputed control. Confidence could not be used to claim shared property. A room could not be cleaned of family memories since they caused discomfort. Even when the person testing them was wearing a crown, authority demanded boundaries. The lesson was documented. Contact was made with long-serving staff who had been let go. A few received offers to return to their previous roles. The household building had to be rebuilt with the assistance of others. Neutral authority over guest arrangements was restored. The authority to determine which family members could enter was taken away from private assistants. The win had consequences, but the lodge was no longer an extension of Camilla's office. For Catherine, restoration also meant protecting memory. Items connected to earlier generations were treated with care rather than as decoration. Charles was suddenly confronted with questions he could not ignore. To what extent had he been aware? Had Camilla used his name because she thought no one would ask him directly? Or had he given his approval for the renovations? Did he realize that private modifications were funded by royal funds? Above all, did he realize that items related to his late mother and Diana had been taken away following written warnings? The questions surrounding Charles did not disappear just because Camilla had left. If anything, the handover made those questions harder to avoid. There was no response. The king was shielded by the stillness, but trust was not. William had discovered that without evidence, family promises were meaningless. Trust had been damaged by the lack of clear answers. A family can survive disagreement, but uncertainty about who approved what creates a deeper problem. Private diplomacy could be interpreted as weakness, as Catherine had discovered. Camilla had learned that while status may postpone repercussions, once the evidence was gathered, it could not remove a signed condition. Windsor's internal equilibrium changed. Employees started being cautious when giving verbal directions. The lesson reached beyond one residence. Staff now understood that informal instructions could not replace proper authority. Once choices were made through private discussions, administrators needed formal permission. Security teams examined who had the authority to limit access to shared housing. The message was understood by every family. Anyone who viewed royal tradition as personal property would face challenges from William and Catherine. As a result, Camilla's departure grew beyond a single lodge, signaling the point at which she was unable to exercise her authority. She had thought that every choice would be protected by Charles's status. She had assumed the staff would keep quiet, William would stay out of trouble, and Catherine would continue to be courteous. Every belief was unsuccessful. The fall was self-inflicted. Camilla's position had changed because the assumption behind it had failed. Status could not erase written conditions. The argument might have been resolved amicably if Camilla had stopped after the initial warning. William might not have demanded the investigation if she had reopened family access, evaluated the spending, or restored the belongings. Rather, each rejection expanded Catherine's file by 1 page. The dispute might have ended much earlier. The longer the warnings were ignored, the stronger the final record became. Every effort to tighten control produced a new witness. Her own choices had created the case against her by the time the notice arrived. Hello viewers, please leave a remark saying yes if you are happy that William and Catherine did not allow Camilla to ignore them. Now subscribe, like, and share this video. Those who back William and Catherine but continue to watch without subscribing are depriving them of the public support that their strongest choices merit. By the end, the evidence did not come from one dramatic moment. It came from many small decisions that had been documented over time. The renovated rooms had been examined by dusk. Once more, the lodge was silent. But not because of dread. It was the quiet that ensues after a conflict when everyone realizes the rules have been altered. Camilla had not just been kicked out of Windsor Lodge by William and Catherine. They had demonstrated to her that calling upon Charles would no longer be sufficient, and the subsequent conflict might be more severe. The quiet after the handover therefore carried a different meaning. It was not the silence of fear, but the silence of rules being restored. The focus of the following film shifts to a private payment file discovered among the renovation accounts, which contains an invoice that was accepted 2 days after Camilla was given her last warning. If the name associated with that payment is revealed, the palace could not have the information that follows. This could indicate if she acted alone. The final warning in the file leaves the story open rather than closed. An invoice connected to the renovation accounts may explain whether the decisions were made by Camilla alone, or whether someone else helped. That question matters because this was never only about a house. It was about authority, trust, family property, and the limits of private power. The records show how one small decision can grow when nobody stops it. Now the next document may show who stood behind the decisions when the warnings were already clear. For William and Catherine, that could be the next test. For the palace, it could become the hardest question yet. And for everyone watching, the story may be far from finished.